Well, we're from Ogden, Utah. I was born and raised there, and Velma was just a little farm town outside. She's a farm girl. She hates to admit it, but she is. We've been married, how many years? 43? 46 years already. And I'm from a railroad family. My dad was a locomotive engineer for the SP before me. And it just kind of come natural, I guess, that I fell in the track with him. Carol has asked me to come down and try to explain a few of the fundamentals about these old black beauties. And I should be qualified. Junior year at high school, I went down for a job just for the summertime, but that was 1940, and in 1982 I finally got away from there. I retired as number one on the seniority list. If we're going to talk about a locomotive, I guess we ought to talk about the railroad a little bit first. Start from the ground up. First place, a railroad is divided into divisions, and the divisions are divided into subdivisions. Now, the men hold contracts to work over an individual subdivision. You have seniority on that subdivision. The roadmen, that is the men who actually man the trains from town to town across country, are divided into two sections. You have engine men and trainmen. The trainmen are mainly concerned with the train. They do the groundwork, like throwing the switches, coupling on, coupling air hoses, and keeping the paperwork. The engine men are the ones that actually run the locomotive. And while we're on that point, I don't want to hear my grandkids talking about driving a locomotive. You run a locomotive. Actually, the guiding is done. The flanges on the wheels sit inside the rail, and that guides it around and turns through the switches and so forth. You do not drive a locomotive. I guess to start with here, we ought to divide the locomotive down in sections. Now, this section right here, right where this doorway is, from that back is the tender, or coal tar as they call it. If you notice this sloping part here, that's the oil. And the rest of the round point there contains water. It takes a lot of water and fuel to run a locomotive. And then, if we come up here, this air acting part here is the locomotive. Now, can you still hear me all right? One thing I want to make clear, this is a steam locomotive, not a steam engine. The difference being a steam engine can be a stationary engine that will run the electrical generator in your power plant or something. A steam locomotive has 2, 3, or 4 steam engines, all running off a common boiler. Now, the terms I'm going to use, it's just going to be natural to come out, and you probably won't find them in a textbook. But they will be the terms that one engine man would use talking to another. For instance, the engineer is always, if he is a good engineer, is referred to as a hoghead. Now, that's not a derogatory remark. The fact is, when you're promoted from fireman to engineer, you become an engineer. You've got to earn the title of a hoghead. The reason for that being a locomotive, this was built in 1912. It's an older locomotive, and like everything we do, we tend to build them bigger and bigger and bigger. When they got about 3 sizes bigger than that, they started to call them a hog. So the engineer just actually becomes a hoghead. And this here, in my day, is what we would call a goat. That's a switch engine. It runs around the yard because it's short. It makes a short bed. It hasn't got the big enough tender to make a long road trip. It hasn't got the capacity for the water and oil. But maybe we ought to divide the locomotive down into 3 parts too, so we can understand what we're talking about. The top black barrel part here is the boiler. The wheels and are the drivers, and the rods, that is called the running gear.
Okay, hold.
This is the drivers and the running gear. Now this business up in here is called the valve gear. That is the secret of the locomotive, where you change gears in an automobile or disconnect and reconnect electrical connections in a diesel locomotive. Here is where you regulate for power and speed through this business here. This is moved. We'll see it better from the other side, so we'll get over there in a minute. But this here is your air pump. Pumps air not only for the controls on the locomotive, but for your air brakes all the way throughout the train. This is the main reservoir. This is where the air is pumped, compressed, held into here, till it's fed back through a feed valve into the train line for brakes on the train. This up here is actually, this right through here composes the actual steam engine. Commonly called amongst an engine, this is a cylinder. The locomotive has 2, 3, or 4 cylinders. 3 cylinders, one sits down in the middle on an eccentric in the axle, kind of like a kid's tricycle. Then with 4 cylinders are actually 2 locomotives under one boiler. They call them Malley. They're named after a Frenchman to come up with the idea of to get more traction and more power out of the one boiler and one crew. It takes a 2-man crew to run a steam locomotive. It takes the fireman and the engineer. Let's start from the top down. That's different, I know, but it's be a little easier to explain. Up on top of the boiler, you see those 3, well, there's 3 domes here. You have 3 domes up there on top of the boiler. These first 2 are sand domes. If you notice these pipes running down, they come right down under the wheels, and that puts sand on the wheels, or on the rail ahead of the wheels, so you don't slide. It's very important because steel on steel, if you don't have the sand, why she'll slip down on the hill and you won't be able to make it. Now that third one back here, that brass thing sticking up, that is the whistle. That dome itself is called the steam dome. That is where the steam from the boiler, being the highest point that is actually connected to the boiler, that's where the steam goes up into. From the steam dome, inside you have a pipe that leads up to the steam chest up here. That is where you open and close the throttle. That puts more or less steam into the cylinders to give you more or less power and speed. That's about a steam press Chester steam chest pressure that you're working. Boy, I'm new at this video stuff, believe me. Well, hopefully when I'm done I got you thoroughly confused because I'm trying. Well, now a little more about the boiler. This part right here is called the fire box. Now the fire box is actually hung inside the boiler with what you call staples. Kind of like when you build a cement foundation, you put the windowsill in and pour the cement around it. That is a little bit the idea of that firebox is enclosed in the cover of the boiler, but it is surrounded by water. The bottom of the firebox is about this level here is fire brick. That's where the fire itself takes place. The front of the firebox, about right through here, has what you call a flue sheet. Now the flues, instead of like the flue on your stove at home go in the air to cause the draft, the flues here run the length of the boiler. I'll come out the head end here, we'll get up there, it's called the smoke box. Now the exhaust gases from the fire go through these flues, heat the water. And then they get up here into the smoke box.
Hi, Mom.
You with me?
Hi, Mom.
Now this part up here that is not covered, incidentally this black is called a jacket. That's insulated underneath that jacket. Now this black part here is called the jacket, and that's 2-inch asbestos strips laid under there attached to the boiler to keep the heat in. That's where your water ends right here. Now up here you have another flue sheet. This is where the gases come out into this part here and go out the stack up there. That creates a draft.
Hey, Grandma.
Hold the outside air through the firebox, heat the air through the flues, and that in turn is what heats the water. Now, we could talk quite a little about the boiler, but that is fundamentally the boiler itself. I believe if we went to the other side, well, we're here in the good light. Let's get the running gear, and then we'll go to the other side. Am I making any sense at all? The front here.
We're going up and down, up and down.
It's called the saddle. As we said, you open the throttle. This heavy business here is called the saddle. As you open the throttle, let the steam in the dry pipe, as we were saying. The dry pipe leads down into this saddle. The steam comes through here into the top portion of the cylinder. The top portion is the valve. Now, the secret of changing gears on a locomotive, like we were saying, is not a transmission at all. You lengthen and shorten the stroke this valve moves in here. Now, you have a port right here. Let the steam in on both sides, and the valve sits here. If you put her in the corner, as we call it, that's 4 forward. Then she's taking a big stroke and letting all the steam in. Then the steam goes, of course, from there down here into the piston. It drives the piston back. This is right here. This is the guide, the gib, and that's the main rod. Now, as the piston comes back, it comes through this main rod, and she's on center here, but the other side's up. You never get them on, you can't get them on center, they're built that way. On center, you won't move. So one side's up and the other side down all the time. So as this comes back, it pushes that turns that wheel. These middle connection rods turn the rest of the wheels in. Hopefully, you're on your way. I believe if we went to the other side, we could do a lot better by looking at the valve gear. Now this is called the reverse gear. It comes through this here tumbling shaft, right through here. It's called the tumbling shaft. This rod here moves that tumbling shaft. If this moves this way, you can see it's going to move this here link block assembly up and down in this. Now bear in mind that this is all hooked solid. Every time the wheel goes around, everything on here has got to make its own move. So if you have this link block assembly right in here, where the rod comes out in the center, which in turn is hooked to your valve here. This rod here is hooked to your link block assembly to your valve. Now this, if it's right in the center of this, it's only making a short stroke. If it's down at the bottom, it makes a bigger stroke. And of course that in turn opens the valve in here wider or a smaller gap, letting more or less steam in. Now the steam pressure that you're actually working is controlled by the throttle, but how much steam you're putting against the piston down here is controlled by the valve. The shorter the stroke, the faster she'll run. And that's one thing about a steam engine that's different than your diesel or your automobile, your gas engine. It won't catch up with itself. That is, automobile engine or a diesel engine, if they don't have precautions built into them and you run them too fast, will actually tear themselves apart. But a steam engine, the faster it runs, the faster it will run. There's no limit to how fast you'll run, just how fast you can keep it on the rail. It will not tear itself apart. And you can work it right to a stall. I mean, a gas engine, you leave the throttle open and you got more than it'll pull, it'll kill the engine. And not true with the steam engine. Electric motor, if you give it more than it'll pull and leave it there, it'll burn it up. Not so with the steam engine. You can leave her wide open, and when she pulls all she can pull, she'll sit right there waiting for the load to release. Either whether you've set the brakes, installed her, or you're on too much of a grade and she can't handle it, whatever you do, she'll just sit there. But of course, that water or that steam will turn to water. Now you can compress steam, of course, but you can't compress water. Therefore, on the bottom down here, these here are cylinder cocks. You open them, the engineer controls them from the cab. He opens them, and then that lets the water out. You remember in the old movies, you see the steam blowing from the front of the engine? That's coming out of the cylinder cocks. The reason for that is, until she gets warmed up, you've got to let that water out of there. When the cylinder is cold, the steam will condense into water. And you've got to let that out, otherwise the piston fits close against the head and lock the head out, as we call it. Turn her off for a minute, let's get water from the tender into the boiler. On this particular locomotive here is done by means of what you call an injector. This pipe here, gravity feeds the water from the tender to this low point here. Then you turn live steam in, and it creates a suction. And that suction brings the water up here along the running board, the front end. There you have what you call a boiler check. Now you have the same pressure inside the boiler. You can't get more pressure on the injector than you got in the boiler. So it's not like you got a standoff. But you have it, the weight of the water makes the difference. The weight of the water will push the check valve open, and that will let the water into the boiler. When you turn the steam pressure off, break the siphon, the steam pressure will close the valve. You must keep water over the crown sheet at the top of the firebox all the time. If you don't, you let the water below, then the crown sheet gets red hot. When the water does cover it, it'll blow up. To prevent it from coming down in the top of the firebox, you got what they call soft plugs. They screw right through the boiler sheet into the water. The water normally covers it. If you let the water below the top of the crown plug, then the crown plug will melt out, the water will come down and put the fire out before she blows up, if everything works according to Hoyle. This big business here called the blow-off cock. You boil away a lot of water, you got a lot of sediment left in it. So periodically, once every 30 minutes or so, you open these blow-off cocks. That takes the sediment right here in the lowest part of the boiler, come out of there, go down through, just like flushing the bathtub after you've had a hard day in the garden. When you get done, there's a little streak in the bottom of the bathtub, so you got to flush that out. And you have to wash the boilers out around the firebox, keep the firebox clean. I'd like to go into a little bit more about how the firebox is actually put in there, but I don't want to get you confused. If you see right here, I don't know if you can pick up this detail. That's the washout and plug, that big plug there. And they have all along the belly of the boiler, as we call them. And that would, you take them plugs out, put water through the top from a fire hose. That washes off the top of the crown sheet. And also, the water comes down to the bottom of the boiler and washes all the sediment out. You got to do that about every 500 miles. Of course, that's a maintenance job. It's done in the terminal. Along with that school of thought, that is one reason why the steam engine give away to the diesel, because the diesel is so much more efficient in terms of time on the road and efficiency from what you get out of the fuel. Now, a steam engine that's operating alongside of a river with a coal plant right there, like you have at the electrical generating plant, they only get up around 20-22% efficiency for the fuel that you burn, the energy you should get. A steam locomotive is clear down around 12 to 15%. But in the old days, they had lots of water, lots of oil, and things weren't as scarce as they are now. Incidentally, the oil that you burn in here is nothing like the oil in your automobile. It looks more like that tar that they put on the highways just before they gravel the highway. It looks a lot like that. In fact, it's back in the tender here. This section here is where the oil is. You got two heaters in there to heat the oil, so in cold weather it will flow into the firebox. This business is a distributed valve, as they call it. That is for the air brakes. And they're a study all by themselves. But roughly what it amounts to, you got a train line all the way through the train. From the brake valve in the locomotive, you put air all the way through that train line, and that comes down into, let's see if we can find a piston here that we can see pretty close. Can we? Part of our rigging is gone, but this is the brake cylinder. Now you put air from that train line, like we said, that went all through the train, in here. That holds the piston back. Then if you take the train line out, the air out of the train line, that lets the piston move. As the piston moves, a rod comes down here and sets the brakes. When you want to release the brakes, you put air back in and that releases them. In other words, it's the opposite to what you might think. You put air in to release them, you take it out to set them. This is, the engineer sits on the right side of the cab. This is what you call a seat box because it's actually a box. It's welded shut now, but the top comes up. That's where you put your suitcase, your lunch, and so forth. Then I had a cushion and you sat on it. This business right here is the throttle. As you open this throttle, then you open the valve into the dry pipe, remember? And that runs the steam down through the sail into the valve that slides back and forth and lets more or less of the steam in. This here lets the pressure into the steam chest, but the valve lets the amount of steam against the piston that actually moves the train. Now these three right here are gone now, but they used to have gauge cocks there, as they call them. They were just a valve that went right straight into the boiler. And when you open them, you must have water come out of the bottom one at all times. If you don't, the water is too low in the boiler, she's in danger of blowing up. Actually, they had water glasses also, but the federal law required to have these steam cocks, gauge cocks. And ideally, you just had it where it trickle out of this center valve. Too much water, then the water raised up with the steam into the dry pipe, and that would wash the lubrication off your pistons and so forth, and the engine wouldn't do as good. Of course, too little water, you're going to blow her up. So ideally, you just had her coming on the gauge cock here, which is about 4 inches above the crown sheet. That is the top of the fireball. Oh, it's gone, but right here is the brake valve. Had a rod there, the handle kind of like this, that you moved around. And as you move this handle, inside, stick my hand where you can see them here, maybe a little, where can you see them better? Inside that brake valve, as you move the handle, there were holes. And you move the handle this way, it would cover one hole and open the other. That would let the air pressure through the various vents in there, which would charge your train line or take it out of the train line. In other words, release or set the brakes at different rates. On the brake valve itself here, you had 4 positions. Way back over here was full release. That's you'd move this handle, this position, that would put all the air available back into the train line. So you can charge your train. You start with nothing, but you can't stop it. You've got to have air in there to get the other side of that brake piston. Remember what we were talking about? To release the brake. Set. You move it over to here, you got her on much fall lap. You've closed all of them ports. There's no air going in and no air coming out, but it will set the brakes on account of the leakage in the train. If the air is leaking out, anytime you lose air, you set the brakes. If you're going to make a controlled stop and you got a lot of room, you put it on lap, and that lets the brakes set gently on the train. You don't get no run-in action. And then, whoops, excuse me, little fella. Then you put it over here, and you get service. Now that takes it out to a rate of 15 pounds a minute. And over here is emergency. That lets all the air out of the train line right now, and That brings your train to a screaming halt. But talking about bringing a train to a screaming halt, of course it depends on your tonnage and the terrain. But let's say you got a tonnage train up around 9,000-10,000 tons. Yeah, I said 9,000-10,000 tons. Of course, that's not all freight. That's the weight of your box shore and everything else. But that's the weight that you're handling. You've got to get stopped. If you got to wound up 50-55 miles an hour, and you want to make anything like a controlled stop, it's going to take you at least 1.25 miles to do it in. Of course, if you go to an emergency, you're going to tear something up, because when you set all the brakes at once, if the head end sets up, the rear end of the train will run into it. In other words, if you got loads on the rear end, they're heavy, and empties on the head end, the empties will want to stop first. The loads will run into them and smash her up. If you got the empties on the rear end will sit down, and the loads will want to keep going, and then you'll break your train in two, which is really not all that uncommon. I've seen just unbelievable things break into. Normally, you just break the knuckle. We'll look at the knuckle on the front of the engine in a minute. That's it. When I started, my dad was a locomotive engineer. He went to work for the railroad in 1912. And he established himself a pretty good reputation on the road. He was what they call the hoghead. And then I come along, and like I say, I quit high school and went down to work for the railroad actually when I was 17, is when I started. But I couldn't get on the road till I was 21. That was the law in those days. I had to be 21 because it was a dangerous job. Not much more so than it is now. And I went firing when I was 21 years old. Well, I went to the Navy first. Uncle Sam was panting down my back. I was serving a Boilermaker apprenticeship for the railroad. When I got done, I would be a Boilermaker. But I went in the Navy, and when I got back out, the road job is what I always wanted, and there was more money there, and if you got to work, you just well work where the money is. So I went firing on the road. Now, a fireman is really, in essential, he's the engineer's helper, but you don't call him that. He is a fireman. He has his own job to do on a steam engine, and a very important job at that. And the first trip I made, I went with my dad, and I tell you, that was an experience. You think I'm a big man, you should seen him. And he could say more with a look than I said here to the last 30 minutes on this TV. You knew who was the boss all the time with him, on the job and at home. And really it was quite frightening for a youngster to be on the old black monsters, as we used to call them. They made just a horrendous noise, and you had to do your best, because one engineer could really get a lot more out of the same steam locomotive as another engineer. There was a difference in talent and how to run them. You run an engine mostly just by the sound, by your ear. You can tell from the crack of the stack, that's the smokestack on front, whether she's doing her best, whether you're putting enough steam in through the valves and working the throttle in the right position. There's more to it than just opening the throttle and letting her go. There's a lot more than that. Of course, the engineer couldn't do no more than what the fireman give him steam to do it with. So you had a lot of more camaraderie amongst the engine crew than on steam than you do diesel, because you had to be a team and you had to work together. But anyhow, I went firing when I was 21 and got promoted to, I guess I was about 32, and I was running an engine from 32 to 62, about 30 years. I run a locomotive, both diesel and steam. Of course, when you start out, you're part of the seniority list, and when I wound up, I was at the top of the seniority list, actually running passenger with diesels. We phased the old steam engines out, along in the middle 60s is when they started disappearing. Like we say, that was mainly on account of efficiency. Now, if we got just a few minutes left on the tape, I would kind of like to show you the coupler on front and how that worked.
Tell them.
I can both tell you a little bit more about my own personal bout with the railroad. I worked out of Ogden, Utah to Carlin, Nevada on the SP. Now, we went right straight out and across the Great Salt Lake. Salt Lake is about 32 miles from Ogden. When I hired out, we used to go over a wooden trestle. At that point, the lake is 32 miles wide and I averaged about 50 feet deep. And when you would stop a train on the trestle, you never used the automatic air. Now the automatic air, of course, would where you set the train brakes on every boxcar all the way back through. You gathered them in gently with the independent or the air just from the locomotive. But stopped your flow. Of course, 20 miles an hour with the top speed on the trestle. If you had to use the air on the trestle to get stopped, the whole thing would go this way with you. And actually, it was quite a big trestle. They had 3 side tracks out there. And in the middle of the lake, they had a town called Mid-Lake, where people actually raised their families. And there was a United States Post Office and everything else, and it was, probably from here to that tennis court, as wide as it was, and little tykes run along there, no front yard to speak of, and right against the main line of the railroad, and as they went too far back, they fell over the bridge into the water. They went the other way, they fell over the other side into the water. It must have been a terrible experience for the ladies, the mothers out there, but anyhow, my run was from Ogden to Carlin, Nevada at 248 miles. We stopped in about halfway, 127 miles from Ogden to a little town called Montello. The only reason Montello was on the map at all is in the old steam engine days, they had to have help to get over the Pequot Mountains. So you would stop at Montello and get 2 engines on the rear and maybe one on the point at the head of your road engine to get it up the mountain to town, a little place up there called Valley Pass. There the helpers cut off and come back to Montello, and the road crew took the train through to Carlin. Like we were saying, if the loads are on the rear end, she'll handle one way. If they're on the head end, she'll handle it another way. Well, if you got maybe 120 empty reefers, that's fruit cars, you can see how they would all sit down because they're empty. Now you turn right around, that's going west. You turn around and bring them same 120 cars east, all loaded, you can see they're going to handle a different way. But they're all loads one way and all empties another, and that's no trick. But then you break that up, and you get about half empty gone coal cars in there, and some box cars, some lumber cars, and one thing another, and it was really an art to run a locomotive and control the slack. Well, we're about come to the end of this run here, and we're going to have to tie up, I guess. Really, I've enjoyed this. I hope I haven't got you thoroughly confused, but I can talk all day about a locomotive and enjoy every bit of it. But time is running out, so is the bill, so we'll tie her up now, and thanks a lot. I enjoyed it.